Welcome to World War One, or Chapter 19. I think a lot of you guys will be interested in this section because it gets to what I think a lot of you are interested in, why World War One happened and some of the fighting. So in this section, we're going to cover sections 1 and 2 in the book, Chapter 19, which is World War One. And the big ideas are, what were the main causes of World War One? Describe the U.S.'s involvement. First we were neutral, and then we had a declaration of war, and then describe the fighting styles of World War One. So what are the main causes for World War One? Now we'll talk about later that there was an actual spark to the war, but the spark had only intensified these main causes. And if you can remember the acronym MAIN, then you should have no problem understanding what the causes stood for. MAIN stands for militarism, the alliance system, imperialism, and nationalism. So the first cause is militarism. And the idea is a key idea for this section. And the definition is the development of an armed forces as their use as a tool of democracy. And what it is it's when a country is developing their military and navy at this time, building up huge reserves, training soldiers, just like you see in this picture here. They're all training to go to war at this time, even though there is no war happening. They're getting ready. This is the idea of militarism. So at this time, Germany had the strongest army in Europe. And it even had a reserve for young German men that every German man, or most of them, would get into. They would train. And even though there was no war going on, they had a large military apparatus. At this time, Britain had the largest navy in the world. So because of militarism, Germany begins to build up their navy, competing with Britain. And Germany having the biggest army wasn't a problem. It wasn't till they started building up their navy that it started to scare Britain and the other countries in Europe, because as they're doing this, they would then have the largest navy and military. As a result, it encourages France, Japan, the US, and others to compete for power of the Navy. So then they all start building up their Navy. And if you remember from last chapter, the United States does this from 1883 to 1900. We kind of get on the rise and then continue. So the next cause is the alliance system. And this is another key idea here. The alliance system is a system of agreements between countries which was intended to promote international security and peace. In reality, it does nothing of the sort. In 1907, there were two major alliances in Europe. First, you have the Triple Entente, or the Allies as they're later known. Please be careful when you're thinking of the Allies. They're not the allies of the Second World War. So this is why I'm going to encourage you to think of it as the Triple Entente instead. It was mainly France, Britain, and Russia. There's many other countries which you'll see join this and leave it at various times, but they're the core three. You also have the Central Powers, which are Germany, the Austria-Hungarian Empire, and then the Ottoman Empire. And if you can see in this picture here, this is an example of how the alliances brought these countries together. So you have the countries in the color here, and then the years here are the agreements that they make in alliance between each other here. So you have a long-standing history. I mean, some of these are dating back 40 years at this time. And you can see they're starting to intertwine themselves, which is how it becomes dangerous. I'm not going to really talk about this slide, but I just wanted to put this image I found on the internet up here because I think it's so valuable to look at. You have all of the powers at this time and where they fell on the Great War map. If you remember, we said for the Allied powers that the biggest ones were Britain. It was also France at this time, and then it was also Russia. The others, join later, and you can see here the years they join, or in the case of Russia, they leave before the end. The Central Powers here is German, and the various German provinces who, they're kingdoms at this time, but united under one German crown. You also have the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and the Ottoman Empire as well. if you want to take a couple seconds, I would pause the video right now to fully look at this picture. So imperialism is the next part of the main causes for World War I. You hopefully know this definition by heart already. It nonetheless is a key idea again. So imperialism is when a stronger nation extend their economic, political, and military control over the other. And you can see here at this time, there is, imperialism by the European powers all over the world. The very dark here are the British, so they have powers in Australia, India, and Africa. Then you have the French here, and this is the French Empire. You also have in Southeast Asia. Then you have the Germans, who are in this part of Africa and parts of Southeast Asia here. So not only is there a lot of conflict on the map right here between the actual powers, but they're fighting somewhat of proxy wars here and conflicts throughout the areas that they're imperializing and colonizing. And they had been amassing large empires for a long time now, for quite at least 50 years of conflict. So there's huge tension in Europe. The reason that the colonies were so important is because it supplied European powers with raw materials and manufactured goods. And we talked about this last week. But as countries like Germany are starting to build up their military, they need a lot more materials, and so the colonies are vital for that. And then you have the largest colonial possessions in France, Britain, and Germany. And they're right next to each other on the map. They also are, like I said, having conflict in the rest of the world. So the last idea is nationalism, or the devotion to interest in culture of one's nation. This is where propaganda comes into effect. Is you have the strong national identity. You are German. You believe in your Kaiser, which is your king, your president, and you believe wholeheartedly in him. You're willing to do anything. You're joining the military if you're a man, and you're invigorated by these images of propaganda here. This is an example from later in the war, but they make you proud to be who you are. So you have huge, national pride. This comes in conflict when you have various ethnic groups. For example, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you have the national, ethnicity, either, Austrian and Hungarian. Then you also have a lot of smaller groups. And this tension is what's going to come to fruition at the actual spark of the war. The best example here is you have Serbia, who is independent country at this time, but there were a ton of Serbians living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This brought those Serbians living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire into conflict with the Austrian-Hungarians. So what sparked all of this tension that's been going on for decades now? And it's what's called the powder keg, or the spark of the war. In June 14th, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was visiting Bosnia, which is one of the areas that was under their control. Bosnia came under the control in 1878. He is the heir to the Austrian throne, so he, is the prince at this time. Once his father, dies or leaves the throne, he's going to take over. But Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian national, while they were in Bosnia, had killed the Archduke and his wife. And you can see here in the map down here that, this is the Austro-Hungarian Empire at this time. Bosnia is right here in the control, and here's Serbia. This is where Serbians live. They also live in this area as well. So this is what happens. This is the final straw, if you will. And on July 28th, Austria-Hungary, the Hungarian Empire, declared a short war on Serbia because they had demanded a series of things from Serbians, a bunch of money, reparations, that it was impossible for Syria to agree with. And so Austria had no other choice, they felt, but to declare war. Really, they wanted to declare war all along, but they gave Serbia an option. And they believed it was going to be a short war because they were this huge power, and Serbia, is a small country at this time with not a lot of economic means, and they're going to be able to take it over. The problem is, based on the alliance system that Hungarian Empire called on its alliance, Bulgaria, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, to declare war with it. And Serbia called on its alliance of France, Italy, and other countries at this point to help it. Germany tells France to stay out of the war, and France says, no way, because Germany's already involved, and France says, if you're involved, you had no involvement really in this conflict, so if you're involved, I have to protect my alliance. So even though France and Germany had no conflict with each other at this point, it was because of the alliance system that the most of the war will be fought between these two countries on French land. And so the fighting begins. On August 3rd, 1914, Germany invades France through the neutral country of Belgium. So you have Germany here, and they are going to France via Belgium. And the reason they're doing this is because at this time, France was very nervous of Germany and had fortified their border right here, if you can see that, the light blue line. This is a fortified border, so it would be very difficult for Germany to enter. So Germany thought it would be much more beneficial if they simply, entered France through a neutral country of Belgium here. And that's what they do. And this plan is called the Schieffelin Plan, which is the idea that they're going to enter France quick, they're going to take the country, and then they're going to focus all their forces on Russia. Because Russia had a much bigger army, but it took a lot longer to mobilize. France was shorter, but quicker to mobilize. So they thought if they could beat France quick, they could take care of Russia. Unable to really, beat France and win the short victory, they had to dig in. And this is when you get trench warfare here, because no side is able to move the boundaries of the war and of the fighting, so instead they dig into the French countryside. So this is an example right out of your textbook, and I think it's really great because it fully illustrates what trench warfare looked like at this time. You have right here at the very back of one country's arsenal all of the guns that would be shooting artillery across the trench to the enemy side. You have the initial frontline trench, and this is what it looks like right here. It's fortified by wood on the side. It's very muddy and wet at the bottom. You have barbed wire at the top to prevent people from getting over. And you have soldiers here with guns 24/7 waiting for the enemy to make a move. Then you have these small communication trenches here to get back to the back lines. The idea is that your trench should never be straight in one line, because if an enemy shooter got in, then they could shoot and do a lot of damage to your entire arsenal. And the distinction I want to make here is the difference between trench warfare and no man's land. A lot of times they're referred to as the same thing, and they're not. This area here is called no man's land. It's the area that's usually about 25 yards or so. It can even be up to a mile wide, and it's covered with barbed wire. Unfortunately, dead bodies are laid there for a long period of time, and this is where no one goes because it's really the land between the two sides here. You're only entering this land if your commander gives you the go, and then you hop on board, and then you're running across trying to shoot the enemy. Unfortunately, with the invention of machine guns, most of the soldiers will be mowed down before they can really get too far. So at this time, the U.S. is neutral. This is a great picture here because it shows, the crisis in Europe. It's showing that everyone's kind of attacking each other, and the U.S. is really on the side over here. We're 4,000 miles away. We don't want to get involved. There's a lot of debate in the country. You have immigrants from all of these countries who are living together in the United States, and they have a lot of nationalistic pride for their home country. But majority of Americans like the idea of peace. They don't want to get involved. However, we are closer to Britain at the time here. We have a strong cultural connection to them. We also were profiting from them very well. At this time, the U.S. exports are rising. We need tons of new workers, so we're admitting more Asians and Mexicans to work in our factories because our exports are rising extremely. You're going from, this level right here all the way up to astronomical levels. In doing so, we're really making economic pacts with Great Britain, France, other European countries that tend to be on the Triple Entente alliance, and not Germany. You can see that by 1915, while we're still neutral, we have almost no exports to Germany. But our neutrality does start to get questioned. And this happens when first Britain has a blockade of their ships. So their goal is to block the German coast, and this is an example of their blockade here that they're using at this time of ships from getting military supplies. Britain then expands to any supplies gained to Germany, and it starts to starve the country. There's widespread famine across Germany. So as a result, Germany has no other choice but to use their U-boats, which is their name for submarines, to respond to the UK blockade. And in these shaded waters here, they attempt to sink any passenger ship or military ship that is going to Britain. And in doing so, they take out a lot of military ships, so Britain's not getting as much equipment as they need. But then at the same time, they're also hitting a lot of passenger ships. The most famous was the Lusitania, who on March 7th, 1915, was sunk 6 miles off the coast of Ireland. The passengers that survived said they were able to see the coast, and then right at that time, the British U-boat sunk them, and over 260 Americans died. So at this time, there's a growing resentment against the German military forces within America. So at this time, sentiments are starting to change in the United States. First, you have President Wilson, who ran on the campaign in 1916 as the president who kept us out of the war. And he called for a peace without victory, a peace between equals, meaning the war should just end. There should be no victor, but we need to stop the fighting because it's very bad for the country, all these countries who are losing men and spending all this money and stuff. Obviously, his words aren't heeded, and Germans begin unrestricted submarine warfare again. And in January 1917, Germans said they would sink all ships that are heading to Allied countries. So this includes France, Britain, Ireland, Belgium, the port of Belgium. And so they're starting to really go after passengers and civilians at this time. So that doesn't sit well with the American public. Then you have the Zimmerman note, and this is the note that's here. It's a very short telegram that the British uncovered and sent to America as a way to rile up Americans and really get us involved, because Britain at this time was using their propaganda to manipulate America. They needed support. And the telegram was from the German foreign minister to the German ambassador in Mexico. And the idea was to keep the United States occupied. If Mexico could enter the United States and engage a war with us, after World War I was over, Germany would then give these lands back to Mexico, the lands they had lost in the Mexican-American War. Then finally, at this time, you have the Russian Revolution that's happening. So the Soviets in Russia are taking over the Russian country, and they got rid of their monarch there. And in doing so, they deposed someone that the United States didn't really like. So now, if they entered the side on the Triple Entente, Russia left, and they were all siding with democratic countries. So Wilson asked Congress on April 2nd of 1917 to make the world safe for democracy. This is the passage that rings out from America at this time. Remember, the president does not have the power to declare war, and so he asked Congress for a declaration of war, and a few days later, Congress passes that declaration, and we declare war against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire. So once we enter the war, we start to mobilize. We start with the Selective Service Act passed in May 1917, which required men to register with the government. Similar to a draft is basically what it is. You have 24 million men that registered, 3 million were called up to duty, 2 million actually made it to Europe, and about 1.5 saw combat. So not as many as registered, but a huge portion of the population. African Americans at this time were segregated into regiments only for themselves and African Americans, and they mostly see non-combat chores. They're the kitchen servers, they're the cleaners, they're those kind of jobs. They weren't viewed as being militarily strong enough to serve in the war. Women at this time could not serve in the army, but they could help the Army corps of nurses on the battlefront. They could, once someone was hurt, they could serve as a nurse to help, repair the wounds and whatnot. The training of these military men lasted 8 months from when they were called up and were 17-hour days, and then they were deployed. So it's a very intense training. Then you have mass production in the United States. Shipyards were the most important thing at this time. And in fact, shipbuilders were exempt from the draft. So even though they were the ones who registered here, they had such an important job of building these ships to get the soldiers to Europe that they were exempt from the draft. Then we are at this time turning our factories into building parts for ships. No factory is building an entire ship, but we're standardizing parts. We're using the idea of the assembly line by Henry Ford to mass produce ships. And as a result, you can see it by this example here, July 4th, 1918, on one day, 94 ships were deployed by the United States. It's also at this time that we are employing African Americans who are making the Great Migration North, women, and immigrants in factories, because all the men left to go to training and to go to war. So we need to fill these 3 million spots of men who were called up, and 2 million who actually went to Europe. At this time, we're exporting more than we ever have before. And in addition, our government needs stuff. So we, are all hands on deck, and there's virtually no unemployment at the time. So as a result, America starts to turn the tide. We have in this time the convoy system that Admiral William Sims develops, and he, talks with the British as a way to combat the constant sinking of boats by the German U-boats. And so what it does is you send destroyers on the side as a defensive boundary. You then send a few cruisers in the middle with supplies, and then your merchant ships, which are in the safe zone carrying all the rest of supplies or people. And as a result, they cut the shipping losses in half from what they were losing from German U-boats. So at this time, the United States is shipping more, and Britain and the countries in Europe are receiving it. The United States Navy helped lay a 230-mile mine barrier from Scotland to Norway. At this time here, the British blockade, the boats left, and they put in mines. This then forces all the German U-boats in this area or to leave through the English Channel. So it helps them navigate the possible options for the German U-boats. And after this time that the convoy system and the minefield were laid in place, only 637 Americans of the 2 million that crossed the Atlantic lost their lives from U-boats. So a drastic change from what was happening before. We also have the American Expeditionary Forces, which was the name of the army at this time. That should say army there, led by General John J. Pershing. And remember, he was the one who went to Mexico to fight Pancho Villa, so he comes up again. And they're considered the doughboys. They're the new guys. They have these uniforms that make them look like a doughboy. They have a white belt. They're also, it's their nickname because they really haven't seen the horrors of the war. They've only heard about it. So they're kind of the fresh, new, naive soldiers. They get to the front lines, and then they really see the horrors that the European soldiers have been dealing with. Here's a series of new technology and problems that are happening. You have machine guns that are just taking out tons of people crossing no man's lands. You have tanks, which are first used by the British. They don't become successful till the following year in 1917. You have airplanes. At this time, though, they're flimsy. They're very difficult to shoot. They're mainly one-manned. So they're not really used for anything. Sometimes they'll fight other airplanes, or they'll carry bombs. That's what they were primarily used for. And they were also used to observe the movements of the other nations on the ground. You also have problems at this time. You have trench foot, a disease that is due to standing in cold and wet trenches. It's like frostbite, it seems. Your toes turn purple and blue, and then you lose your foot. And the only way to really cure it was to amputate the foot or the entire leg, depending on how far it spread. And this was widespread. You also had shell shock, which is an early form of PTSD from the constant bombardment of shells being fired at each other. And then poisonous gas. Germans really pioneered the use of chemical weapons. They use what's called mustard gas, and at first it suffocates a person to death, and in the meantime you start to bleed and you're internally hemorrhaging. So it's a very painful way to die, and these are the masks you see to protect themselves, and some soldiers who are firing guns and using the mask in case of a military bombardment by gas. So the fighting finally dies down. The Russian forces leave, and so the Germans send their forces back to the west. Once they do that, it's the same time that Americans are coming in, and you have a series of Allied victories here. As a result, Austria-Hungary leaves. They surrender to the Allies on November 3rd. They can't take it and sustain anymore. Germany then soon follows because there's a mutiny within the country here. They have soldiers and workers who've established their own republic, the Weimar Republic. And as a result, the Kaiser steps down. His government is toppled, it's finished, there's nothing else he can do. Then Germany signed a ceasefire or an armistice on the 11th day of the 11th month of the 11th year. So November 11th of 1918 at 11 in the afternoon. And here are some examples. You know, this is the British newspaper, or the American newspaper, excuse me. They're so excited that the armistice has been reached. Victory is here. They signed it in a train car in France. You have the leaders of the various countries here. This will become symbolically important as Hitler seeks to avenge this defeat in World War II. He will force the French to surrender in the same train car as a symbolic way. Now, peace was reached. In the meantime, we'll talk about more how the peace terms come about, but was peace really reached? You have over 11 million people died, just soldiers, at this time from the war, and it's estimated that 20 to 30 million people total around the world lost their lives, whether it's civilians in U-boat sinkings, or civilians in France, or soldiers. So, is peace reached? Yes. Was it a peaceful time in Europe? No. And so, let's review really quick. I know this is a longer video, but what are the main causes? You have, very good, the main causes of World War I. Militarism, the alliance system, imperialism, and nationality, sparked by the death of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Then you have America's involvement. At first, we were neutral until 1917 when we couldn't take it anymore. The sinking of ships, the Zimmerman Note, the public dissatisfaction with Germany led us to declare war. Then we declared war. The United States entered. We helped them, establish the convoy system. We did a series of mines and oceans. We helped them pioneer new technology. We built ships, all to defeat the Central Powers. So in the next video, we will talk about more what happens at home, and then we'll talk about the war and the peace as a result. So that's it. Until next time, Husky historians.